The rain doesn't just fall in this city. It drowns. I found the bar by accident, or maybe by design, the way grief always finds the darkest room in the building. The Obsidian Hotel. All black marble and low light, where the chandeliers hummed like they were keeping secrets. I sat at the far end of the counter with a glass of something expensive I couldn't taste, watching the city smear itself against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Neon bleeding into neon. Red into blue into nothing. I wasn't looking for him. But he was already there, at the other end of the bar, jacket dark as the room, a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. He didn't scan the space the way men usually do. He simply occupied it, the way a storm occupies a sky before anyone thinks to check the forecast. Our eyes met once. That was enough. He smelled of expensive bourbon and something colder underneath, metallic, clean, like a blade kept in still water. He didn't ask my name. I didn't offer it. The rain kept falling. Neither of us moved to leave. I woke up to the gun first. It sat on the nightstand the way a confession sits in a room, quiet, undeniable, changing the shape of everything around it. Black and flat and impossibly still against the warm wood, beside the bourbon glass and the lamp that had burned through the whole night without either of us thinking to turn it off. For a long moment I simply stared at it, my mind running the slow, stupid arithmetic of waking, cataloging the silk sheets that weren't mine, the rain still pressing against the glass, the city outside muted and gray with early morning, before the full weight of what I was looking at landed. A gun. On my nightstand. In a hotel room I had paid for. I sat up slowly, the sheet pooling at my waist, and that's when I felt it, the particular quality of stillness that isn't emptiness. The kind that has a source. I turned. He was awake. He had probably been awake for a long time. Kai Draken sat in the chair by the window, fully dressed, jacket on, as though he had never truly undressed from the night before, as though the hours between midnight and morning had been a transaction he had observed rather than participated in. One ankle rested on his knee. His hands were loose in his lap. But his eyes, dark, unhurried, and terribly precise, were fixed on me with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they already own. He didn't say good morning. I pulled the sheet higher, not because I was cold. That's yours, I assume. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. I tilted my chin toward the gun. He glanced at it. Then back at me. Yes. You left it on my nightstand. I put it where I could reach it. There it was. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just the plain architecture of how he moved through the world, utility first, sentiment nowhere. I studied his face in the gray morning light, trying to reconcile it with the man from the bar, the man who had sat beside me for 2 hours before either of us said a single word, who had eventually said my name, Lyra, as though he had already known it, and watched my reaction with those same unhurried eyes. The tattoos climbed his neck above the collar. I had noticed them the night before in the neon-smeared dark, but in the flat morning light they were different, deliberate, intricate, a vocabulary I couldn't read. Something serpentine curled just below his jaw. The ink disappeared beneath his collar and I found myself wondering, with a clarity that embarrassed me, how far it went. I pushed that thought away and focused. I don't usually wake up next to firearms, I said. Most people don't. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile. Something more controlled than that. You handled it well. I haven't handled it at all. I've barely handled this. I gestured vaguely at the room, at him, at the entire night condensed into the space between the chair and the bed. He watched me do it. You will. It was the certainty that unnerved me most. Not arrogance. Arrogance performs itself, needs an audience. This was something quieter. The certainty of a man who had simply seen enough outcomes to know which way they tend to fall. I swung my legs off the bed, reaching for the robe that had been abandoned at its foot, pulling it on with the kind of deliberate calm I wasn't feeling but refused to surrender. I needed coffee. I needed the 18 inches of space between us to feel like an actual boundary and not a suggestion. You should go, I said. He didn't move. I'm serious. I know. He uncrossed his ankle from his knee, leaned forward in the chair, not standing, just shifting his weight, redistributing it in that quiet way that somehow made the room feel smaller. Before I do. Last night, you said something about your father. The air changed. I had not expected that. In the dim blur of 2 a.m. and too much expensive bourbon and the particular recklessness that grief teaches you, I had apparently said something I had no memory of saying. The thought crawled over my skin. I say a lot of things, I said carefully. You said it wasn't an accident. The city outside went on being gray. The rain tapped at the glass like it was asking to be let in. I stood very still in my borrowed robe in a hotel room that smelled of him and waited for my heartbeat to decide what it was going to do. My father died 4 months ago, I said. Each word deliberate, flat, sealed. The official report said his car left the road in the rain. Mechanical failure. I paused. He maintained that car like it was a living thing. He had never had a single problem with it in 11 years. Kai said nothing. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't name, not pity, not curiosity. Something more complicated. Something that looked almost like recognition. The police were satisfied, I continued. Everyone was satisfied. I was the only one who. I stopped. I pressed my lips together. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because you haven't told anyone else. It landed with the quiet precision of everything else he said, no flourish, no dramatic pause, just the truth placed in the room like a stone on a table. I hated that he was right. I hated more that I could see it on his face, that he had known he was right before he said it. You need to leave, I said again. Softer, this time. More honest. He stood. Unhurried, inevitable, the way everything about him seemed to be. He crossed the room, not toward the door, but toward the nightstand, and picked up the gun with the ease of someone picking up a set of keys. He turned it once in his hand, a small habitual motion, and slid it somewhere inside his jacket. Then he straightened his collar, and for a moment he was close enough that I could see the tattoo at his jaw in full detail. The serpent, I realized, was eating its own tail. He looked at me. Lyra. My name in his mouth was still the same strange thing it had been at 2 a.m. familiar. Deliberate. As though he had decided what to do with it long before I gave it to him. There are things about your father's death, he said, that no official report will ever tell you. My breath stopped. And when you're ready to know them, he reached into his jacket and set a card on the nightstand, in the exact place the gun had been. You'll know where to find me. He walked to the door. He didn't look back. He simply left, taking the stale bourbon air and the particular gravity of him with it, leaving only the rain, the lamp still burning, and the small white card on the nightstand. I stood there for a long time before I picked it up. No name. No number. Just an address. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself this on the drive back to my father's house, with the cards sitting in my coat pocket like a coal, warm, specific, impossible to ignore. I told myself this while I stood in his study for the first time in 3 weeks, surrounded by the particular silence of a dead man's things, the stacked files, the cold coffee mug I still hadn't moved, the framed photograph of the two of us at the coast the summer I turned 19, both of us squinting into the same light. I told myself this right up until I opened the bottom drawer of his desk. I had been through this drawer before. Twice, in the raw weeks after the funeral, when I was still operating on the blunt animal logic of grief, searching for something without knowing what. Bills. Insurance papers. A leather journal that turned out to be nothing more than a record of garden maintenance going back 11 years. I had replaced everything carefully and closed it and told myself there was nothing there. I had missed the envelope. It had slipped behind the false back of the drawer, the thin gap between the wood panel and the frame, barely a finger's width, and it would have stayed there indefinitely if the card in my pocket hadn't made me look harder than I had before. The envelope was plain. No name on the front. The seal had been broken and repressed, or perhaps just dried unevenly. Either way, it had the texture of something handled too many times by hands that weren't sure what to do with it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No greeting. 12 lines of my father's handwriting, small, compressed, the way he wrote when he was thinking faster than his hand wanted to move. I read it standing up, the drawer still open at my feet, the afternoon light coming through the study window at a low angle that made the room feel like the inside of an old photograph. Most of it was in shorthand I didn't recognize. Abbreviations, numbers, what looked like partial addresses. But 3 lines near the bottom were clear enough, legible and deliberate, as though he had wanted whoever found this to understand at least that much. They will come for the ledger before the month is out. If they find it first, everything ends. D knows. D has always known. Trust no one with the mark of the serpent that eats itself is the seal of the Draken Syndicate, and the Draken Syndicate does not leave witnesses. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on the floor of my father's study, which was not something I had planned to do, and I stared at the wall until the words stopped rearranging themselves and simply sat there, terrible and still, in the exact order he had written them. The mark of the serpent. I put my hand in my coat pocket and took out the card. Plain white. Just the address. I turned it over, and there, so small I had missed it the first time, embossed rather than printed, visible only when the light caught it at the right angle, was a symbol at the very bottom corner. A serpent. Eating its own tail. The same mark I had seen curling beneath the jaw of the man who had left my hotel room that morning. The same mark my dead father had written a warning about in a hidden letter in a locked drawer in a house that was supposed to hold nothing more dangerous than old utility bills and garden journals. I sat with that for a long time. The rational architecture of the thing was simple enough. Kai Draken was connected to something my father had been afraid of. My father had died in circumstances I had never believed were accidental. Kai had told me, without any apparent effort at deception, which was somehow the most unsettling part, that there were things about my father's death that no official report would ever reveal. The irrational part, the part one kept pressing at like a bruise to test whether it still hurt, was the way he had said my name. The way he had looked at me in that gray morning light with something in his expression that was not quite pity and not quite guilt but occupied the territory between them in a way I couldn't dismiss. I had 2 options. I could call the police with a hidden letter, an embossed card, and the name of a man I had slept with once. I could watch them file it and lose it and explain to me gently that grief does strange things to perception. Or I could go to the address on the card and look the man in the eye and ask him directly what he knew about my father's death. I knew which one I was going to do. I knew it the way you know things you haven't admitted to yourself yet, the decision already made somewhere beneath the thinking, the rest of the mind just catching up. I photographed the letter on my phone, replaced it in the envelope, replaced the envelope behind the false back of the drawer. Then I stood up, straightened my coat, and looked at the photograph of the 2 of us at the coast for a long moment. What did you know, Dad? I thought. And how long did you know it? He squinted back at me from 11 years ago, cheerful and unhelpful. I drove across the city as the last of the afternoon light dissolved into the particular bruised purple of a wet evening sky. The address led me not to any building I had expected, not an office, not a warehouse, the blunt concrete vocabulary of organized crime that exists mostly in films, but to a residential street in the oldest part of the city, where the buildings were tall and dark-windowed and set back behind iron gates as though they had decided long ago to stop explaining themselves to the street. The house at the address was the tallest on the block. I sat in my car outside it for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock with the focused attention of someone trying to give themselves enough time to change their mind. At the end of the 4 minutes I got out of the car, walked to the gate, and pressed the intercom. Silence. Then a click. Then his voice, low, unhurried, carrying the same quality of unsurprised calm as everything else about him, as though he had been watching the clock from his side of the gate and had simply waited me out. I wondered how long you'd sit there. I stared at the intercom. You saw me. I see most things, Lyra. The gate opened. I looked at it. I looked at the house beyond it, lit from within, warm against the darkening street. I thought about the letter in my father's drawer. The serpent on the card. The certainty in his voice that morning when he had said there are things about your father's death that no official report will ever tell you. I thought about turning around. Then I walked through the gate. Behind me, without any sound at all, it closed. The inside of the house was nothing like the street. The street was old stone and iron and the particular dignity of things that have decided to endure. The inside was something else, clean lines, dark wood, rooms that opened into other rooms with the unhurried confidence of spaces that had never needed to justify their size. No clutter. No softness. Every surface chosen rather than accumulated, the way a man furnishes a house when he has never once lived in one by accident. It was beautiful the way a well-made weapon is beautiful. Intentional. Cold at the center. A woman I didn't recognize led me through the entrance hall without making eye contact or offering her name. Mid-50s, gray-haired, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned a long time ago that invisibility was a professional asset. She opened a door at the end of a corridor and stood aside, and I walked into a room that was all low lamplight and dark bookshelves and the particular stillness of a space that gets used for serious conversations. Kai was standing at the window. He turned when I entered, and for a moment we simply looked at each other across the room, the same assessment we had conducted in the hotel bar, except that this time both of us knew considerably more and considerably less than we pretended. He was still in dark clothes, still carrying that quality of contained stillness, but here, on his own ground, it had a different texture. Less restraint. More authority. You found the letter, he said. Not a question. I stopped walking. How do you know about the letter? Because your father wrote it for you to find. He moved from the window, unhurried, gesturing toward the pair of chairs set at an angle near the fireplace. He told me he would leave something. In case. In case of what? In case of exactly what happened. I didn't sit. I wasn't ready to sit. Sitting felt like a concession I hadn't decided to make yet, and with this man I had the persistent instinct that every small decision was load-bearing. You knew my father. Yes. Well? He considered the word with the same precision he seemed to apply to everything. Well enough that he trusted me with things he trusted no one else with. Well enough that his death, something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, a tectonic thing, deep and brief, was not a business matter to me. The fire moved. Outside, the rain had started again, finding the windows with its familiar insistence. I sat down. He sat across from me, leaned back, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, and told me the shape of it, not the details, not yet, but the outline. My father had spent 3 years working as a financial consultant for a network of holding companies whose legitimate surface concealed a structure he hadn't fully understood when he took the contract. By the time he understood it, he knew too much to simply resign. He had spent the following 2 years quietly, carefully building a record, a ledger, detailed and encrypted, of everything he had learned. He had come to Kai because Kai was the only power in the city's underworld whose interests ran counter to the men my father was documenting. He came to you for protection, I said. He came to me for an alliance. The distinction, clearly, mattered to him. Your father was not a man who asked for protection. He asked for a partner with sufficient leverage to make the information he'd gathered mean something. And the night he died? The fire. The rain. Kai's eyes on mine, dark and steady. He was bringing me the ledger. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. I let it sit there between us because I didn't yet trust what would come out of my mouth if I opened it. My father, driving through the rain with a ledger full of evidence, on his way to this house, to this man, and then the road, and the car, and the official report that said accident, and the coffee mug on his desk that I still hadn't moved. Who killed him? My voice was someone else's. Flat and clean as a surgical cut. I have a name, Kai said. I don't have the proof. The ledger would have provided it. Without it, the name is just an accusation, and the man it belongs to has enough institutional cover to make accusations disappear. He paused. Along with the people who make them. I looked at him. Is that a warning? It's a fact. His eyes didn't leave mine. The same people who killed your father know he had a daughter. They will have considered whether he told you anything. So far they have concluded he didn't, that you are a grieving woman and no more. Another pause, deliberate and weighted. That assessment has a shelf life. And there it was. Delivered without drama, without the theatrical gravity that lesser men would have wrapped around it, just the plain statement of a danger with a countdown attached. You're telling me I'm not safe, I said. I'm telling you that your apartment offers you the same protection as the car your father was driving. The illusion of it. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and for a moment the lamplight caught the tattoo at his jaw, the serpent completing its endless circle. There are 12 rooms in this house that have never been compromised. A security infrastructure that has kept considerably more valuable things than one person alive. And I have a reason, he said, to keep you specifically breathing. The ledger. Your father may have left more than the letter. If he trusted you enough to hide the first piece, he may have hidden others. Things you haven't found yet because you don't know what you're looking for. He held my gaze. I do. I sat with that. The transactional clarity of it was almost a relief, easier to hold than the alternative, which was the possibility that he had some other reason to want me close, one that neither of us was prepared to name, in a room with a fire and rain at the windows and the memory of last night still occupying the air between us. So you want me to move in, I said. I want you to be alive in 6 weeks. Those aren't mutually exclusive with my own apartment. They are. No hesitation. No apology. I stood up and walked to the window where he had been standing when I came in. The street below was empty, the iron gate closed, the rain turning the lamplight into long smeared columns on the wet stone. I thought about the drive over. The way I had checked my mirror 3 times without deciding to. The car that had been 3 vehicles behind me since the hotel district and had turned when I turned until I'd lost it, or told myself I had, near the river. I turned around. Kai was watching me from the chair. He hadn't moved, hadn't pressed, hadn't filled the silence with anything, just waited with that particular patience of his that felt less like courtesy and more like certainty. I want access to everything you know about my father, I said. Every conversation, every document, every name. Nothing withheld. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise. Closer to satisfaction, quiet and carefully contained. Agreed. And I'm not a guest, I said. I'm not something you're storing for safekeeping. If I'm here, I'm part of whatever this is. He looked at me for a long moment, the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. Agreed, he said again. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. I'll need to go back to my apartment for my things. Ren will go with you. I don't need. Ren will go with you, he said, with exactly the same tone, and I understood then, with perfect clarity, the particular nature of the cage I had just agreed to walk into. Not iron. Not locked from the outside. Something more sophisticated than that. A cage built of logic and leverage and the devastating reasonableness of a man who always made sure that every door he opened was one you chose to walk through yourself. The gray-haired woman appeared in the doorway as though she had never left it. I followed her out. I had been in the house for 11 days before I saw the scar. Not for lack of proximity. The house had 12 rooms, but we occupied the same 3 with reliable consistency. The study where Kai worked through the mornings with the focused silence of a man dismantling something complicated, the kitchen where Ren produced meals at intervals that seemed governed less by clock and more by instinct, and the library, where I had taken to spending the evenings with my father's files spread across the long table while the rain continued its patient assault on the city outside. We had developed, without discussing it, the careful grammar of 2 people sharing space across a fault line. Courteous distance at breakfast. Focused, almost collegial efficiency during the hours we spent cross-referencing my father's shorthand against the documents Kai had kept. He had been true to his word, had produced files I hadn't known existed, records of meetings and transactions that mapped the last 3 years of my father's life in a way that was illuminating and devastating in equal measure. And then, in the evenings, a particular quality of silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite tense but occupied the narrow territory between them, charged with everything neither of us had yet found the architecture to say. It was on the 11th night that the silence broke. I had been drinking the good whiskey. Kai kept a bottle of something single malt and unreasonably old on the library shelf, and on the 3rd night I had simply helped myself and he had watched me do it and said nothing, which I had taken as permission. I was sitting on the floor with my back against the couch, files in a semicircle around me, when I reached across a stack of documents and the sleeve of my shirt pulled back past my wrist. He was sitting on the couch behind me. I felt rather than saw the moment his attention shifted. "How did you get that?" he said. I looked down at my wrist. The scar was old, 8 years old, a thin raised line following the curve of the bone, silver white in the lamplight. A climbing accident when I was 22. 3 days in hospital, my father sleeping in the chair beside the bed, refusing to go home. Fell, I said. Off a rock face in the Cairngorms. I was trying to prove something to someone who wasn't watching. A beat of quiet. Did you prove it? I proved I could fall a significant distance and survive it. I pulled my sleeve down, then stopped, and pulled it back up. I was tired of the careful grammar. Tired of the measured distance. Your turn. He was still for a moment. Then he set down the file he'd been reading and held out his right hand, turning it palm up on the couch beside me. Along the inside of his forearm, half hidden beneath the edge of the tattoo that climbed toward his elbow, was a scar that made mine look like a hesitation. Wide, deliberate, the kind that takes time and intention to produce. How old were you? I asked. 17. I waited. There's an initiation, he said, with the flat tone of someone describing a weather system rather than a chapter of their own history, in the world I grew up in. You don't choose whether to participate. You only choose how you carry what it leaves behind. He turned his arm over, closing his hand. I chose the tattoos. They became a way of covering what I hadn't chosen with something I had. I looked at the ink, the dense, deliberate patterns that covered his arms, climbed his neck, disappeared below his collar. I had spent 11 days carefully not thinking too specifically about what lay beneath the collar. What do they mean? I said. All of them. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached up and loosened the top button of his shirt, and then the next, with the unhurried practicality of a man consulting a reference text, and leaned forward so that the lamplight fell across his chest and shoulder. I didn't move. I was aware of the whiskey in my hand and the fire at the far end of the room and the files spread around me like the debris of my father's secret life, and beneath all of it, the low persistent current that had been running between us since the hotel bar, since the gray morning and the gun on the nightstand, since the gate closing behind me 11 days ago. He pointed to a bird on his left shoulder, dark-winged, wings folded, head down. That was the first man I lost. Not killed. Lost. He was 23. I was 19. I made a decision that I believed was tactically correct and he died because of it. The bird's wings were folded in the posture of something that has stopped trying. I had it done the week after. So I would carry him correctly. He moved his hand to the serpent at his jaw. This one you already know. The syndicate. My inheritance. He said the word the way I had heard people say the names of illnesses, accurate, unsentimental, devoid of self-pity. My father built it. My father also burned most of what he built in the last year of his life, for reasons that took me a decade to understand. What I run now is what was salvageable. Which is not everything he intended it to be. A pause. Which is, I think, closer to something worth running. I was looking at his face rather than the tattoo by now. He was looking at his own hands. And the one on your ribs, I said. Because I had seen the edge of it once, when he'd reached for something on a high shelf and his shirt had lifted, a fragment of something that looked like text, or a map, or both. He looked at me then. For a moment something moved behind his eyes, the same deep tectonic thing I had seen the first night, when he had mentioned my father's death. He lifted his shirt. The tattoo covered the left side of his ribcage in dense, layered script, names, I realized, line after line of them, written in a hand so small I would have needed to lean close to read them. Dozens. Maybe more. Who are they? I asked, though I thought I already knew. Everyone who died in my proximity, he said, that I could have prevented. Or should have tried harder to prevent. He lowered his shirt. Your father's name is not on it yet. The yet sat in the room like a lit fuse. Because you don't know if you could have prevented it, I said slowly. Because I don't know if I did. His voice, for the first time in 11 days, had something raw running beneath its surface, controlled, barely audible, but there. The night he was coming to me. The route he took. I gave him that route. I chose it because it was the one with the least surveillance coverage. He met my eyes. I have spent 4 months deciding whether that makes me responsible. The fire. The rain. The names on his ribs that I couldn't read from here. I put down the whiskey glass. I reached across the distance between us, not far at all, and pressed my hand flat against his forearm, over the scar he'd carried since he was 17. He looked down at my hand. He didn't move away. It doesn't, I said. And then, because honesty felt like the only currency worth spending in this room, at this hour, but I haven't decided yet whether I believe that myself. He turned his arm beneath my hand, slowly, carefully, until his palm was against mine. Outside, the rain kept falling. Neither of us moved to pull away. Chapter 5. The dress was black, which felt appropriate for a funeral. Ren had left it on my bed that morning without comment, a thing of considerable architectural ambition, backless, with a neckline that suggested confidence I would have to manufacture from scratch. Beside it, a small card in Kai's handwriting, tonight. 8 o'clock. Wear this. No please. No explanation. I had stared at the card for a full minute before picking up the dress, which I think was exactly the response he had anticipated. The Caldwell Foundation Gala was held every November in the ballroom of a building old enough to have watched the city grow up around it and privately disapprove of the result. 11 floors of pale stone and Baroque ambition, the kind of building that appears on the covers of architecture books without ever needing to do anything else to justify its existence. The Caldwell Foundation, I had gathered from an hour of careful reading that afternoon, distributed approximately $40 million in charitable grants each year to causes of cultural and civic significance. It also, according to 3 separate documents in my father's files, served as the primary vehicle through which the man whose name Kai still hadn't given me laundered the financial infrastructure of half the city's organized crime network. 40 million in charitable grants. The mathematics of respectability. Kai met me at the bottom of the stairs. He was in black, of course he was in black, I suspected he owned nothing else, a jacket cut with the kind of precision that made clothes look like decisions rather than garments. He looked at me in the way he had of looking, which was completely and without performance, and said nothing for a moment. "You look like trouble," he said finally. "You invited me." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. He offered his arm. The car took us across the bridge, the city spreading itself out on both sides of the water with its usual indifference to human drama, all lit windows and dark water and the smeared reflections of things too bright to look at directly. Kai sat beside me and briefed me with the focused efficiency he applied to everything: names, faces, relationships, the precise social topography of the evening ahead. Lord this. Senator that. The woman in green who ran 3 shell companies and sat on the board of the National Arts Council. The man with the silver hair who had attended every gala for 15 years and had never once made eye contact with anyone who wasn't useful to him. "And who am I?" I asked. "You're mine," he said, with the same tone he used for facts about the weather. I looked out the window. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters tonight. Every person in that room will assess you in relation to me. Your history, your profession, your grief, none of it registers. Only your proximity." He paused. "Stay close. Watch the room. Talk to anyone who approaches but volunteer nothing. If someone mentions your father. Does someone know about my father? Someone always knows something." His jaw set slightly. "If it comes up, you heard about the foundation through a colleague. You came tonight out of personal interest in the arts program. You have never heard the name Draken before in your life. I absorbed this. And what are you doing while I'm performing ignorance?" "Looking for the ledger." I turned to look at him. "You think it's there?" "I think the man who had your father killed believes it was never delivered to me. Which means he believes it still exists somewhere accessible. Which means tonight he may make a move toward whatever he thinks is the next step in finding it." He met my eyes in the dark of the car. I want to watch him decide what that step is. The ballroom was everything the building had promised: high ceilings dripping with chandelier light, walls paneled in the kind of dark wood that absorbs sound and secrets with equal appetite, a string quartet in the far corner producing the particular music that exists primarily to give wealthy people something to ignore. 200 people, perhaps more, in the formal geometry of serious money, clusters and orbits and the gravitational pull of influence, the room organizing itself the way these rooms always do, power accumulating at certain fixed points while everything else circulates around it. I took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and did not drink it. In the first hour I met a cabinet minister who shook my hand for slightly too long, a property developer whose smile never reached anywhere near his eyes, and a woman named Celeste who ran the Foundation's education initiative and spoke with such genuine warmth about its impact that I felt the particular vertigo of encountering real goodness inside a corrupt structure, the way it makes the corruption worse by contrast, not better. Kai moved through it all with the fluency of a man who had been navigating these waters since before I knew they existed. Courteous, unhurried, occasionally funny in the dry surgical way that made people lean toward him without knowing they were doing it. Beside him I watched his eyes, because his eyes never entirely matched the rest of it. They were always doing the other thing, the real thing, cataloging and measuring and reading the room with the same cool precision he brought to my father's files. I saw the moment he found what he was looking for. The man was perhaps 60, silver-haired, lean in the manner of someone who considers physical condition a professional obligation. His name, I would learn later, was Edmund Hale, though that evening he was simply the man whose entrance altered the room's atmospheric pressure in a way I felt before I identified its source. People adjusted their positions, subtly, unconsciously, the social equivalent of plants orienting toward light. He wore his authority the way Kai wore his, not performed, not announced, simply present, as though the question of whether it existed had never once been worth raising. He was looking at me. Not with particular intensity, not with anything a bystander would have identified as threatening, just a long, assessing look of a man filing information. His eyes moved from me to Kai and back, and for a fraction of a second, something passed across his face. Not surprise. Something colder and more deliberate than surprise. Recognition. Kai's hand found the small of my back. Light, steady, the exact pressure of a message. Stay close. I smiled at something the cabinet minister was saying and did not look at Edmund Hale again for the next 40 minutes. I talked and laughed and held my untouched champagne and felt the room the way Kai had taught me to feel it, not as a social event but as a system, all its pressures and currents and the information that moved through it beneath the surface of the conversation. At the 41-minute mark, I watched Edmund Hale cross the room to a man I hadn't noticed before, younger, unremarkable looking, the kind of face that vanishes from memory while you're still looking at it, and exchange perhaps 6 words. The younger man nodded once, set down his glass, and left the ballroom. Kai was at my elbow before I finished processing it. Did you see? I said quietly. Yes. Who is the younger man? Someone I need to identify before morning. His voice was low, his mouth close to my ear, to any observer the posture of a man saying something private and pleasant to the woman beside him. Hale knows I'm looking. He just sent someone to move something before I can find it. I looked at the space where the younger man had been. The ledger. Or whatever remains of it. A pause. We need to leave. We said our goodbyes with the unhurried grace of people departing a pleasant evening at a reasonable hour. Kai's hand at my back the whole time, guiding me through the room with the light insistent pressure of someone steering a ship away from rocks it can see and I cannot. In the car, crossing back over the bridge, I stared at the dark water below and thought about Edmund Hale's face in the moment he had looked at me. The recognition in it. The cold calculation that had followed it like a shadow. He knows who I am, I said. Kai looked straight ahead. Yes. He knew my father. Yes. The city lights moved across the water. I held my untouched champagne glass, which I had apparently carried out of the building without noticing, and listened to the quiet engine and thought about the 40 million in charitable grants and Celeste's genuine warmth and the names written in tiny script across Kai's ribs, and I understood then, fully and without any remaining comfort of doubt, exactly how deep the water was that I was standing in. Tell me his name, I said. Kai was quiet for a long moment. Then, Edmund Hale. I held it in my mouth like something I wasn't ready to swallow. He killed my father. It was not a question. Kai's silence was not a denial. Outside, the river slid darkly past, indifferent and old, carrying the city's secrets toward the sea the way it always had and always would, regardless of what any of us decided to do about them. The bourbon was Kai's idea. 3 days after the gala, with the name Edmund Hale sitting in the house like an uninvited guest, present in every room, referenced in half the documents spread across the library table, the fixed point around which everything else in my father's hidden life had quietly orbited, Kai declared a moratorium on the files. 2 hours, he said. No documents, no cross-referencing, no maps of corruption drawn on the backs of financial statements. Just the bottle of unreasonably old single malt and the library and the fire and whatever passed for ordinary conversation between 2 people conducting a complicated negotiation with their own restraint. I thought it was a good idea. I thought this right up until the window exploded. It happened in the sequence that violence always uses, ordinary, 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 then suddenly not. Kai was talking, which was itself unusual enough that I had been paying close attention, something about a city he had spent 3 months in when he was 24, the quality of light there, the way it made everything look simultaneously ancient and temporary. He was almost relaxed. I had been watching the unfamiliar architecture of that, the way his shoulders sat differently, the way the careful management he applied to every room he occupied loosened its grip fractionally in the evenings, in the library, in the specific amber radius of the single malt and the fire. Then the window exploded inward and the lamp beside my head disappeared. The sound was enormous and then immediately absent, replaced by the pressurized silence that follows sudden violence, the silence of a room reassessing itself. Glass across the floor. Cold air flooding in from the street. The lamp on its side, the shade shattered, the bulb somehow still burning with the dogged persistence of something that hadn't received the relevant information yet. I was on the floor. I didn't remember deciding to be on the floor. Kai was not on the floor. He was moving, already moving, had been moving before the silence finished forming, in the way that I would later understand was not reaction but something prior to reaction, something installed so deep it predated conscious thought entirely. He crossed the room in 4 steps that were more geometry than movement, reaching beneath the desk with the certain hand of a man who knows exactly where he put things, and came up with a gun that was not the one I had first seen on my nightstand, though it carried the same quality of deliberate intention. He didn't look at me. He looked at the window. "Stay down," he said, and his voice was completely different. Not cold. Cold implies a temperature, implies something that was once warm. This was something that had never been warm, a register I had not heard from him in 14 days of careful proximity, and the shock of it was almost physical. The man who had spoken about the quality of light in a foreign city 30 seconds ago was simply gone, the way a flame goes, completely, instantaneously, without residue, and in his place was something I didn't have accurate language for. He went through the door low and fast. I stayed on the floor among the glass and the cold air and the still burning lamp and listened to the house. Footsteps above me, ran, somewhere upstairs. A door. Outside, the street, which had been quiet and was now quieter still, the particular quiet of a space recently evacuated by people who know something the remaining people don't. Then, 3 shots. Close, from the side of the house. Then 1 more, further away. Then nothing. I counted to 60. Then I stood up, which was a decision I had not cleared with anyone, and found a piece of broken lamp base that was heavy enough to be useful, and went to the doorway. The corridor was empty and dark. I went left, toward the sound, because staying still had started to feel worse than moving. I found him in the narrow service passage that ran along the side of the house, a space I hadn't known existed, accessible through a door behind the kitchen that I had taken for a pantry. He was crouched over a figure on the ground, methodical and unhurried, checking the man's pockets with the focused efficiency of someone completing a familiar administrative task. The figure on the ground was not moving. I registered this and then stepped back from registering it, placing it in a part of my mind I would deal with later. Kai looked up when I came in. Something moved across his face, not surprise, he never seemed surprised, but something in the vicinity of displeasure. I said, "Stay down. You were gone a long time." I was gone 4 minutes. It felt longer from the floor. I looked at the man on the ground. Young, unremarkably dressed, face slack and absent in a way that settled the question. Is he? Yes. I absorbed this. The broken lamp base was still in my hand. I set it down against the wall. Kai stood, sliding the gun away with the same habitual economy I had seen that first morning in the hotel room. He looked at me across the narrow passage, assessing, the way he always was, but with a different quality now, the way a man looks at someone who has seen something he would have preferred they hadn't. "Who sent him?" I asked. "The same person who always sends people." He reached down and turned the man's wrist over, and there, small, dark, unmistakable, was the serpent eating its own tail. Hale wanted to know what we found at the gala. This was his method of asking. I looked at the tattoo on the dead man's wrist. The same mark on Kai's jaw. The same mark my father had written a warning about in careful compressed handwriting in a hidden drawer in a house that was supposed to be safe. "He was one of yours," I said slowly. "The syndicate." "He was one of Hale's." "There's a distinction." Kai's voice had begun its return, the familiar register reasserting itself, the warmth of the library version of him bleeding back in at the edges, though something underneath remained altered, like a room after furniture has been moved. Hale has spent 3 years recruiting from the syndicate's lower ranks. It's how he maintains the fiction that we're aligned. It's also how he gets information about our movements. He knew we'd be in the library. He knew we're always in the library at this hour. His eyes moved to mine. Which means the moratorium was a mistake. Pattern is a vulnerability. I thought about that. I thought about the 40 minutes of ordinary conversation, the quality of light in foreign cities, the almost relaxation in his shoulders. I thought about how effectively Hale had weaponized normalcy, had waited for the precise moment we stopped performing vigilance and simply existed in a room together. "This is what you are," I said. It came out without accusation, which surprised me. Just the flat statement of a thing I was arranging into its proper position. When it matters. This is the actual version. He looked at me for a long moment. In the poor light of the service passage, with the cold air coming in from somewhere and the dead man between us and the gun settled back in its place beneath his jacket, he looked entirely like what he was, the head of a criminal syndicate who had just killed a man in his own corridor with the calm administrative efficiency of someone dealing with a recurring problem. "Yes," he said. Simply and without apology, the way he said most true things. I nodded. I had known it, I realized, had known it since the first morning, since the gun on the nightstand and the eyes that watched me across the hotel room with that particular quality of complete, possessive attention. I had simply been allowing myself the comfort of the library version, the man who spoke about foreign light and held my hand over a scar and wrote names on his own ribs to carry his dead correctly. Both things were true. That was the part that undid me. "We need to move," he said. "Not the house is defensible. But the files. If Hale sent someone tonight, he's escalating the timeline. He's looking for the ledger," I said. "He thinks we're close. He thinks you're close." Kai's eyes held mine. "You're the variable he didn't account for. Your father's daughter, inside the house, with access to documents he doesn't know the full scope of." A pause. "He's going to stop sending single men." The cold air moved through the passage. The city outside was beginning to reassemble its ordinary sounds, distant traffic, rain returning to the windows, the world reconstituting itself around the violence the way it always does, indifferently, efficiently, without ceremony. I looked at the man on the ground one final time. The serpent on his wrist. The absolute stillness of him. "Then we need to find it first," I said. Kai looked at me with something that was almost, in the low light of the passage, almost what I had seen in the library 14 days ago. Not the coldness. The other thing. The thing that lived beneath the coldness and occasionally surfaced in the evenings, in the amber radius of the single malt and the fire, when both of us forgot for a moment to be careful. "Yes," he said. "We do. I found it on a Tuesday." Not the ledger itself. The ledger remained wherever my father had hidden it with the infuriating thoroughness of a man who had trusted no one, including, apparently, his own daughter with its precise location. What I found was something adjacent to it, something that reoriented the entire map I had been building for 6 weeks and left me standing in the library at 2 a.m. with a document in my hand and a particular cold clarity that felt nothing like the grief I had been carrying and everything like its replacement. It was a letter. Dated 14 months before my father's death. Written in his hand, addressed to no one, sealed and placed inside the false back of a book I had pulled from the shelf because I had run out of other places to look. I read it once quickly, the way you read things when you're afraid of what they contain. Then I read it again slowly, which was worse. Then I went to find Kai. He was in his office. He kept the hours of a man who had never entirely trusted sleep, who treated rest as a concession to biology rather than a genuine desire, and he looked up when I came in without knocking, which I had never done before. He registered my face and was already straightening in his chair, the file he'd been reading set aside, the full weight of his attention repositioning itself toward me with the speed it always moved when it mattered. I put the letter on the desk between us. He looked at it without touching it. Then he looked at me. "Read it," I said. Something in my voice made him pick it up carefully, the way you handle something that has already caused damage and might cause more. He read it. I watched his face, which was the exercise in futility it had always been, the expressions present but compressed, operating at a frequency that required more time and proximity than I currently had the patience for. He set it down. Lyra. You were 17, I said. When my father found you. He was still. That's what it says. That he found you at 17, running money for the syndicate's Eastern operation because you had no other viable option, and that he spent 4 years, teaching you accounting, law, the architecture of legitimate finance. He said, my voice caught on something and I pressed through it. He said you were the most precise mind he had encountered in 30 years of professional life. He said he considered you. I stopped. I had memorized the line before I understood why. He considered me what? Kai's voice was completely quiet. A son, I said. He wrote that he considered you the son he never had and the student he never deserved. The fire had burned low. The rain was absent for once, the city outside sitting in an unusual dry stillness that felt like the weather holding its breath. Kai sat behind the desk and looked at the letter, and I stood across from it and looked at him, and the silence between us had a different quality from every silence we had shared in this house, denser, more freighted, carrying the weight of everything both of us had been careful not to examine too directly for 6 weeks. You knew him, I said. Not as an informant. Not as an alliance. You knew him the way I knew him. Not the same way. Close enough. Something was rising in me, not anger, not quite, something more complicated and less manageable than anger, the specific pain of a loss suddenly doubled, suddenly revealed to have dimensions I hadn't known to grieve. He mentored you. He gave you what he spent 30 years accumulating, and he never once mentioned your name to me. Not once. He was protecting you. Kai stood, slowly, the way he moved when he was being deliberate about not seeming threatening. Everything he kept from you was structured to keep you outside the radius of what he'd walked into. The more you didn't know, the safer you were. He's dead, I said. The strategy had some operational flaws. Something crossed his face. Not flinching, he didn't flinch. But the nearest he came to it. The night he died, I said. I want everything. Not the version you've been giving me. Everything. He came around the desk. He didn't reach for me, didn't close the distance entirely, stopped at the edge of the lamplight and stood there with his hands at his sides, the most unguarded posture I had seen from him and somehow the most dangerous feeling, the way wide open spaces can be. Your father came to me 18 months ago with what he had on Hale. The financial records, the shell companies, the full network mapped and documented. We built the ledger together. He held my eyes. He wasn't just a source. He was my partner in constructing the evidence. It took 14 months. We were 3 weeks from having something clean enough to take to the 3 people in this city's legal structure we both believed were uncorrupted. And then he died. And then he died. A beat. The route I gave him, I told you I've spent 4 months deciding whether it makes me responsible. The truth is that the route was clean. I verified it myself, 3 hours before he drove it. What I didn't know, what I had no means of knowing, was that Hale had a source inside my own house. I went very still. Not Ren, he said immediately, reading my face. Someone I removed 6 weeks ago, shortly after you arrived, when I found an anomaly in the security logs. A man who had been with me for 4 years. His jaw set. Hale had been running him for 2 of them. Long enough to know the route. Long enough to arrange what happened to your father's car before he reached it. The room was very quiet. I thought about my father driving through the rain. The route Kai had given him. The car that the official report said experienced mechanical failure on a road my father had driven 100 times. You didn't kill him, I said. Slowly. Rearranging the map again, piece by piece. No. But your compromised security did. He absorbed this without deflection, which I had known he would. It was one of the things I had come to understand about him over 6 weeks of close quarters, that he accepted the full geometry of his own culpability with a directness that most people couldn't manage. He put it on his ribs and carried it. That was how he worked. Yes, he said. Which is not the same thing and is also not entirely different. I looked at him across the narrow distance between us, this man who had been taught by my father, shaped by my father, who carried the names of his dead in small careful script across his ribcage in my father's absence in the space where one more name hadn't yet been written. This man who had built walls around me and called it protection and might even have meant it. This man whose coldest, most lethal self I had watched operate in a service corridor 3 weeks ago and whose other self, the one that existed in lamplight and old whiskey and the careful grammar of two people trying not to want the same thing, had dismantled my defenses so gradually I hadn't noticed them falling. The ledger, I said. I know where it is. He went completely still. I've known for 4 days, I said. I've been trying to decide whether to tell you. Something moved across his face that I had never seen there before, unguarded and unmanaged, there and gone in a second but real, unmistakably real. And, he said. And my father trusted you with everything except my safety, I said. He kept me out of it to protect me. He put your name on a page and sealed it in a book because he thought if something happened to him, I'd find it and understand. I paused. I understand. I crossed the distance between us. Not all of it, I left enough for both of us to remain clear-eyed about what we were choosing, but enough that I had to tilt my chin to hold his gaze. Enough that I could see the names at his jaw and the controlled steadiness of his breathing and the thing in his eyes that had been living behind the distance and the careful management for 6 weeks, patient and certain, waiting. My father knew you'd keep me alive, I said. I'm choosing to believe he also knew what else would happen. Kai's hand came up, slowly, the way he did everything when he was being deliberate, and his fingers curved along my jaw, his thumb at the edge of my cheekbone, the lightest possible pressure that somehow carried the full weight of everything that had been unsaid in this house. Where is it? He said quietly. His garden journal, I said. 11 years of garden maintenance. The last 40 pages aren't maintenance records. His eyes closed for a fraction of a second. When they opened, the thing behind them had shifted, relief and grief and something that looked, in the low light of the office, very much like the expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for too long. Lyra. My name. His voice. The same register it had held in the hotel room that first morning, deliberate, careful, as though he had decided what to do with it long before the moment arrived. I know, I said. Outside, the dry stillness held. The city waited. The fire burned low and amber in the grate, and between us the distance that remained was no longer careful management but simple acknowledgement of what we were, what we'd lost, what we were about to do about it. Neither of us moved to waste what was left of the night. The garden journal had 43 pages of ledger entries hidden inside it. My father had been meticulous. Of course he had been meticulous. This was the man who maintained a car for 11 years without a single mechanical fault, who balanced his personal accounts to the penny, who had once spent an entire Saturday afternoon reshelving his books by publication date rather than author because he had decided that chronology told a more honest story than alphabet. The entries were dense and precise and encrypted in a system that took Kai 4 hours to crack, working at the desk in focused silence while I sat across from him and read the sections that didn't require decryption, the names, the dates. The column headings that mapped Edmund Hale's network with the quiet devastation of a man who had spent 3 years watching something monstrous operate behind the face of philanthropy and had written every detail down with the care of someone who understood. That the writing might be the only thing that outlasted him. It did. We worked through the night, the two of us and the journal and the low fire and the particular silence of people engaged in something that matters, the kind of work that has its own gravity and pulls everything else, exhaustion, grief, the residual electricity of what had not quite happened in the office 3 hours ago, into its orbit and holds it there, suspended, for later. By 4 a.m. we had the full map. Kai sat back in his chair and looked at it, the reconstruction we had built across 6 sheets of paper, the network laid bare, the money trails and the shell companies and the names of the 11 people in positions of institutional authority who had been either purchased or coerced into maintaining Hale's cover. The 40 million in charitable grants. The judge. The 2 senior police commissioners. The cabinet minister whose hand had held mine for slightly too long at the gala while his name, it turned out, appeared in my father's ledger beside a figure that represented a decade of comfortable compromise. How do we use it? I asked. Kai was already reaching for his phone. There are 3 people in this city's legal structure your father believed were clean. He named them in the last section. He looked at me. Did you read that part? Yes. I had read it 3 times, in fact, because the 3rd name on my father's list had made me sit very still for a long moment. A senior prosecutor named Carla Voss, who had been building a case against Hale's financial network for 2 years from the outside, without the interior evidence to make it hold. He knew about Voss. He was hoping to reach her before the end. Kai set his phone down. She's been waiting for something exactly like this. You know her. I know of her. She has been, on several occasions, a professional inconvenience. The corner of his mouth shifted. Which is the most reliable indicator of integrity available to me? I looked at the map on the table. My father's 43 pages of careful documentation. The name Edmund Hale sitting at the center of it like a stone at the bottom of a deep well, the thing everything else had been dropping toward. He'll know, I said. When we move toward Voss, Hale will know within hours. He still has people in positions to watch. Yes. Which means we have one opportunity. If we go to Voss and it doesn't hold, it will hold. Kai's voice carried the register I had come to understand was not arrogance but the particular confidence of a man who has assessed a situation completely and reached a conclusion he can defend from every angle. The ledger is clean. Your father built it to be unimpeachable. 43 pages of documented transactions, cross-referenced with banking records I can independently verify, covering an 8-year period. Hale has institutional cover. He does not have institutional cover against this. I looked at him across the table. The fire behind him, the map between us, the journal closed at my right hand. And after, I said. When it's done. What does this look like? He held my gaze. He understood what I was asking, not about the legal outcome, not about Hale. About the house, the library, the 11 days that had become 6 weeks that had become the fixed point around which my own life had quietly reorganized itself without my explicit consent. That, he said, depends on what you want it to look like. It was the most open thing he had ever said to me. No architecture of certainty around it, no careful management of outcome, just the plain admission that this particular variable was outside his control and he was, I understood with something that moved through me like the first warm day after a long winter, entirely willing for it to be. I want to finish this first, I said. Then we'll talk about after. He nodded, once. Then he picked up the phone. We met Carla Voss at 6:30 in the morning in a building she chose, with protocols she set, and she sat across from us with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting for this specific moment for 2 years and intended to use every second of it correctly. She read the ledger in silence for 90 minutes while Kai provided the supporting documentation and I sat beside him and thought about my father, his compressed handwriting, his meticulous columns, the 43 pages he had written knowing he might not survive to deliver them personally. He had delivered them. Just not the way either of us had imagined. Voss looked up from the final page. She looked at me first, then at Kai, with the expression of someone recalibrating a significant number of prior assumptions. Your father built an airtight case, she said to me. This is prosecutable. This is more than prosecutable. She set the journal down with the care of someone handling evidence, which it now was. I'll need 48 hours to position it correctly. If we move before the structure is in place, Hale's people will have enough institutional access to delay proceedings long enough for him to disappear, Kai said. Yes. 48 hours, I said. What do we do in the meantime? Voss looked at Kai with the pragmatic assessment of a woman who had decided to work with a criminal enterprise for the first time in her career and was making her peace with the geometry of it. You keep her alive, she said. And yourself. Hale will move when he realizes the timeline has shifted. He'll realize tonight, Kai said. He has someone in the building we met at this morning. Voss didn't blink. Then we have until tonight. We were back in the house by 9. Kai moved through the security protocols with the focused efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this contingency since the window exploded 3 weeks ago. When repositioned, the 2 remaining members of his inner security briefed. The house locked down in a way that made it feel less like a residence and more like what it actually was. The defensible position of a man who had spent his adult life understanding that safety was architecture, not feeling. I stood at the library window and watched the street below and thought about the first night I had stood at a different window in this house, for minutes in a parked car, the gate closing behind me. Kai came to stand beside me. We stood there for a while in the particular silence that had evolved between us over 6 weeks, not the careful grammar of the early days, not the charged distance of 2 people managing something they hadn't named. Something that had settled. Something that had, without ceremony or announcement, become its own kind of language. He'll send more than one this time, I said. Yes. Are we ready? He turned to look at me. In the morning light, the serpent at his jaw, the names on his ribs beneath the dark fabric, the eyes that had watched me across every room in this house with the same quality of complete, unhurried attention since the first morning in the hotel. Are you? He said. I thought about my father. The compressed handwriting. The photograph on his desk, both of us squinting into the same summer light, before any of this had a shape. The coffee mug I had never moved. I thought about the garden journal. 43 pages of careful documentation that had cost him his life and might now, finally, do the thing he had intended it to do. I thought about the man standing beside me, what he was, entirely and without comfortable simplification, the coldness and the names and the library evenings and the hand along my jaw and the low light of the office, the whole complicated truth of him. Yes, I said. Outside, the city went about its ordinary business under a rare clear sky, the rain finally, briefly, absent. The light was clean and direct, the kind that makes things look exactly as they are, no distortion, no flattering blur. He reached down and took my hand. Not the careful tentative pressure of the scar night, not the message-bearing guidance of the gala. Simply his hand, and mine, the full steady weight of it. We stood at the window together and watched the street and waited, no longer strangers, not quite what we were becoming, occupying the exact true point between what had been lost and what was still, against considerable odds, possible. The light held. For now, it held.